Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning into Working Your Worth in the Workforce. We're going to go ahead and get started. Again, my name is Alyssa Louise McCall, and I will be your host today. So before we get started officially, I want to go through a few logistical pieces. Again, this is a series that will include three various webinars over the next few weeks that all have to do with working your worth in the workforce during this COVID-19 crisis. So this is week one, where we will be going through honing your sparkle. During the second week, we'll be walking through different things around assessing your needs and learning a little bit more about how you can best assess your needs during this time, especially as it has to do with the workforce. And then lastly, week three, boundaries are not an option. I think that one speaks for itself. We'll be walking through different tools for how to best assert your boundaries during this time as well in the workforce. So with that being said, and we do have our chat open, so I would love to make this as interactive as possible. So let's just see some either thumbs up or some excitement in the group chat around this question. So hopefully you all are ready to work your worth. So throughout the webinar today, please feel free to communicate through the chat box if you have any questions, or you can also raise your hand in order to speak virtually, and then I will take you off mute. So with that being said, I would love to have everybody take a quick moment to answer a question live for us. So I'll take you off mute if you feel comfortable, and you can say your first name and just name one thing that you admire about Michelle Obama. And if you don't feel comfortable coming off mute, feel free to just introduce yourself in the chat box and I can read it out loud for you. And I see we have Alexis on the line as well as Jamie. So one second, I'm just taking you off mute.
Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you now.
Oh,
Perfect.
yay. Sorry, this is my first time using this platform, so I was
No
like
worries.
trying to test all the buttons and figure things out. Okay, good. And I can mute myself so that you don't hear you.
Yep, perfect. All right, then. And I know I said your name for you, but did you want to say one thing that you like or admire about Michelle Obama?
Oh, yes. Hi, everyone. Alexis. I I really admire her dedication to her family. Even throughout like the entire presidency, she always took time in for her family and for her kids, and she always, would put pictures of family on like Instagram and things like that. So I always just really admired her ability to work really hard as the first lady, but also just make sure she was dedicating quality time to her family. It was really sweet. It was a good thing to see.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that with us. All right. Did you want to go next?
Hi. Yes. So, Jamie, and one thing I admire about Michelle Obama, just her poise. Like she is such a great example to look up to, and like when she walks into a room, like everyone can just like notice her presence, and it's just black excellence.
Yep. Thank you. And thank you for sharing that. All right, so I will mute you two again, but thank you for sharing us. And if anybody else ends up wanting to drop anything into the chat box, feel free to, or to share it verbally as we're going through tonight's presentation. So again, my name is Alyssa Louise McCall, and I am a psychotherapist in Washington, D.C. So I asked you that question for a few reasons, but I think first it makes sense for me to tell you all a little bit about some of my experiences in the workforce. And again, we all have moments where we don't work our worth in our job or in our career. And I can recall one of my very first few jobs. I was not only the only person of color there, but I was also the only young woman of color. And when hearing those three different things, especially when taking intersectionality into consideration, unfortunately, those three things can cause others to perceive me differently in the workforce as well as in the world overall. And what I didn't realize during the time at one of my very early jobs is that sometimes we allow the false images of how others perceive us to cloud how we show up in spaces, or even how we perceive ourselves in these spaces, and also with that, how we perform, which can potentially create a cycle of shaping how you interact with others and also how they interact with you. So little did I know in those early years, there is so much assumption around and so much messaging around what it means to be a young woman of color. And others may have a false sense of your identity because of this. And it's going to be very, very crucial to take that into consideration and ground ourselves in who we are and what we want to eventually grow into as well, because it allows us to fight against those messages and bring our authentic and best selves into spaces, which will also help us to advocate for ourselves and ensure that our needs are being met in whatever spaces we bring ourselves into. So I say that quick story because, again, with the title of this webinar and the title of this week's focus of Honing Your Sparkle, it's going to be very crucial to kind of ground ourselves in those positive messages, or how I like to call it, of honing your sparkle, to acknowledge what your strengths are, having a clear understanding of how you identify in different spaces and how you want to show up, so that these different messages or even false perceptions that others may have of you cannot cloud how you interact or show up in those different spaces. So with that being said, it's very important to look at two key terms. A lot of times, of course, this first one we hear of, self-esteem, comes up automatically for us, of your overall confidence and your value. But there's another term that isn't as often talked about, which is our self-efficacy. And this term really just breaks down your belief in your ability. And when looking at your self-efficacy, it's also important to look at career self-efficacy, which is how you believe in your ability, but as it pertains to your career and your role. During this time especially, there's a lot of uncertainty that's taking place. And oftentimes that uncertainty can cause us to question and doubt ourselves, but also experience a little bit of anxiety, which may make it a little difficult for us to show up as our best selves in spaces. So it's going to be really crucial in everyday life as young women of color, and then especially during this crisis, to ground ourselves in understanding our self-worth. So that we can focus on strengthening not only our self-esteem, but also our self-efficacy and career self-efficacy. So when looking at some of these things, and I'm going to open the chat box in a moment just to hear some things from those on the call. But some of the recommendations that we can focus on during these time, I broke it into 3 different activities, and I know we're going to be with one another over a 3-week time span. But some activities that I always recommend for learning how to hone your sparkle is making a list of characteristics that you like or admire about yourself. And I always recommend shooting for at least 10 and making this a living, breathing list, so that you continuously have that list to go to during tough times, where you aren't feeling your best self in your job or career, but also using it to kind of ground yourself in, to have a full understanding of your worth. And then secondly, turning this list into a list of affirmations, and use this daily. I know oftentimes when we think of affirmations, the Hollywood image of it comes to mind, where, you know, we're picturing a strong woman who has all these sticky notes all over her mirror, with these different positive words and phrases on them. That is one way to do affirmations, but also it can be as simple as thinking of a characteristic that you like or enjoy about yourself, and then putting "I am" in front of it, so that it's something that you're continuously speaking over yourself. Scientifically, it is proven that the more that we kind of recognize and verbalize these different positive traits about ourselves, the more that they start showing up in our actions and the way that we see ourselves, but then also in the way that other people are perceiving us as well, because of what type of energy we're giving off in spaces. So, highly recommend turning that list of 10 into affirmations for yourself. One app that I do recommend to folks when thinking of creating affirmations for the first time is ThinkUp. And I can drop it down into the chat for everybody as well. But this app allows you to record yourself doing affirmations, so that it's something that you can play in the midst of your daily routine, to hear yourself verbalizing those things, and have that be constant top of mind for you. Or it's something that you can even consider tying into daily meditation as well, where you're having these reoccurring messages come up for you, and it's that positive reminder that you can have in the midst of a busy day as well. The last activity that I would highly recommend doing during this time is ending each workday with personal reflection and listing at least two things that you did well, or two things that you accomplished during your workday. Oftentimes, when we're in the midst of a busy schedule or even a chaotic schedule, as many of us are experiencing right now, we never really pause to reflect on what things we're doing well or what things we're succeeding in. Our minds may often come to thinking of, oh man, I wish I did that today, or I wish I did this or that better. So it's going to be very important for us to practice incorporating those different positivity moments in our day, so that we have that on our foundation to remember how well we're doing and how we do add value to different spaces that we're a part of as well. So I want to pause and pose this question to folks right now inside of the chat. So feel free to answer inside of the chat, but thinking about what moments or what messages have come up for you in the past, when whether it's through media or from images that you've seen, or even from things that you may have heard from other people around young women of color as it pertains to the workforce. And while a few people I see are typing right now, one that I'll bring up that I've constantly heard from people is looking at videos even, or looking at different things that may have come up in the media of seeing women of color as lazy or incompetent. That's one that I've heard a lot. And I see somebody wrote seeing women of color in the workforce not being treated fairly or equally. Yep. So as we're reflecting on some of these things that have come up, one more that I see is that they have to work twice as hard to get recognition or equal treatment. Yep. And another I'm seeing is being overlooked. Mm-hmm. So while we reflect on some of these things that we're constantly seeing inside of media or inside of messages, or even just from things that we've heard from people, it's important for us to take that time to really dig deep on where some of these messages have shown up throughout our life. because oftentimes we may not realize it, but this messaging may have an impact on us, and we may not even notice until we're seeing ourselves react in different ways or engage with people in different ways. So it's going to be important to understand, as we are going throughout this 3-part series, kind of looking back at some of those messages and learning how you can fight them for yourself, so that it's not turning up in the way that you perceive yourself, or turning up in how you interact with others in spaces. One that came up inside of the chat is this feeling of being overlooked, and looking at how that may impact the way that you view yourself. And one affirmation that I always encourage people to use inside of their life, and this is one that will continue to bring up a little bit throughout this series, is that I am worthy of being heard. Oftentimes when we are used to being overlooked or treated unfairly or unequally, we kind of go into this frame of feeling like we aren't worthy of being heard. And it may not necessarily be something that we're saying to ourselves every day, but it may be something that is showing up automatically inside of our actions, with how maybe not speaking up in moments where you do deserve to speak up and advocate for yourself, whether it's for a raise, or whether it's with even something as little as taking a break or taking a vacation. So it's going to be very crucial to look at these messages over the next few weeks as well, to see how they're showing up for you, and ways that you can continue to build yourself up with that. So we can take a moment now to see what thoughts, questions, or comments are coming up for everybody right now. And feel free to utilize the chat box. Oh, I see one brought up. It says, what are some tips for navigating an uncomfortable environment, such as male dominant and lack of diversity? Yep, that's a very great question. So you'll notice that over these next few weeks, some of the things that we're going to be focusing on in some of these activities are going to be very useful for you. Oftentimes in environments that may be male dominated, or, for a different race or ethnicity that we belong to, it can cause us to doubt ourselves in those moments, especially if we're experiencing secondhand doubt almost, where people may be doubting us or looking at us differently in these spaces, and it can cut us off from being our best selves in these moments, and being able to display our full potential. So one thing that I do recommend is really grounding yourself in some of these self-esteem building and career self-efficacy building activities, because in these moments, we kind of get in our head a little bit. We start to question ourselves, and we start to question our ability because of the way that other people may or may not be perceiving us in moments. So it's going to be important to be rooted in knowing who we are and knowing what we do bring to the table. So I really think for that question, Jamira, the activity, let me go back to the slide. Activity number 3 is going to be very beneficial for you, and utilizing a journal in order to do this, because when we're trying to navigate different spaces, again, we learn to kind of go back to this space of wondering what we can do better, or wondering how we are doing, and questioning if we did good enough. But there may already be some things that you're doing really well in that space. So it's going to be important to reflect on that as well, so that that can be something that is constantly top of mind for you as well. So another question I see, if someone struggles to think of things that they like about themselves, good characteristics, where is a good place to start? That is a great question as well. So one thing that I always recommend for people when reflecting on this is using some time to really take some self-reflection. Sometimes as we are journaling, answers will come to us automatically that we may not have realized that we already had. So taking some time to really dive into that discomfort around identifying those characteristics so that we can learn to break that down. But also, Alexis, looking at some of the things that may have happened throughout our day. Sometimes the things that we did well in the midst of our day can actually highlight a positive characteristic about ourselves. So let's say, for example, you took some time to register for a wellness webinar during this time. When looking at that piece, thinking of what positive characteristics that may bring up about you for taking that initiative to focus on your own well-being. And then another exercise that may be beneficial for that, sometimes it's helpful to utilize the ABCs when thinking of characteristics about ourselves that we may admire. So going through each letter of the alphabet and looking at a characteristic that starts with each letter that can be positive about us. But one thing that I can send out to everybody and bring to the next session with you all is a sheet that walks through various positive characteristics. Because sometimes as we are looking at other positive lists of characteristics, it makes it a little bit easier to think of those tools. But also, you can even ask people who are close to you and people who you respect and who are also great representations of who you are as well. I know a lot of us have people in our life who we're really close to who have a great read on us. Sometimes it is helpful to have reflective spaces and healing circles with people close to us and ask them if they even have any recommendations. All right, so if there aren't any additional questions, I do want to point out to everybody that I will be sharing some additional tips and additional pieces around this as well through social media, just throughout our 3-part series. But I am on social media under Sis Everyone Needs Therapy on Instagram as well as Facebook. So definitely check those out over the next few weeks for additional tools and additional items to add to your toolkit when focusing on honing your sparkle. But if anybody does end up having any additional questions after today's webinar or over the next 3 weeks, I do encourage you to connect with me. I'm happy to jump on a care call with you and talk about some of these pieces a little bit more in depth and to help you assess what needs may need to be incorporated into your routine during this tough time. So here is my email address as well as my phone number. So with that being said, thank you all for joining today's webinar around working your worth in the workforce during the COVID-19 crisis. And I look forward to connecting with you all over the next few weeks and hearing a little bit more around what things you incorporated into your routine to help yourself focus on building self-esteem and building career self-efficacy. All right, thank you.